everybody. Thank you again for joining. I know that there's a lot of interest, especially in today's times and climates, about how to build your, grow your own food. And as Raleigh mentioned, soil is just an integral part of that. It's such a huge portion of being able to grow nutrient dense, really good food, and you can do it without chemical inputs. In fact, you can grow fantastic food, highly productive without chemical inputs. So before I get started in the presentation, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. So as Raleigh mentioned, I've been a homesteader since I was a child. My parents were homesteaders. I did take a small break of homesteading when I was in the military, and my wife and I did live in the city for a short period of time, but the itch was always there, and we had to get back onto the land and start growing our own food. So at the homestead I'm at now, my wife and I have been here for 17 years. And I have to say that when I first started homesteading, my parents, I learned from my parents, my grandparents, they were very conventional in their methodologies. We rototilled, we used fertilizers and herbicides and fungicides and all the sides. There was a good chemical mix in our garage, and that's how we ran our homestead. And as a kid, that's what I knew. So when we first started our homestead here, applied the same principles. But as an adult, I didn't feel comfortable with spraying some of these chemicals that had all this really, you know, detrimental impacts. I'm putting that in my food. It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I explored different alternatives, and it really started with me going down the permaculture route. Looking at how I can grow, different systems that had multi-story species and things like that. And I was getting good results without having to use chemicals, but I still didn't quite know why was it working so much better. And I came across Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is a world-renowned soil scientist, and I actually trained underneath her. So I'm a soil food advisor through Dr. Elaine Ingham, and I own my own business called Sprouting Soil. And while I was doing the homestead and all the other kind of stuff, I did work in the high-tech industry. Another one of my loves was computers. As a child, I was a computer geek, and that's why I went into the business. But it was just a very large corporate structure, and for me, it wasn't very satisfying. And so I decided to make a switch. My passion is growing food and converting soil, so that's why I went down this route, and now I have my own business, and it's extraordinarily rewarding. I'm really thankful that I took this path in my life. Okay, so for me today, I'm here to kind of share with you some of the knowledge that I've learned over the years, and we're going to find that there are some things that you can do right away to actually start improving your soil. So with that, I'm going to do a small overview of the soil food web, just explain to you the importance of soil biology and the interaction with plants. And then we're going to get into kind of what are some 5 things you can do right now to really help improve your soil. And then I'm going to show you an example or a couple of examples actually from my own homestead. And you can see kind of, some of the practices that I put into place and some of the results that I was actually able to get. Okay, so let's talk about the soil food web. And for some of you, and maybe most of you, you've seen this graphic. It's been out there for quite some time, but it does a very good job of explaining the different players involved with the soil food web. And really, it starts with plants. Plants are an extraordinarily important aspect of the soil food web. Most people think of plants above ground. You see what you see, but the interaction with the roots, with the soil biology, is extraordinary. And we're going to talk about the role that plants actually play in just a minute. But then we also have what is the microorganisms that make up the soil food web. And we're going to talk a lot about predator-prey types of interactions as well. So we have kind of our first layer of organisms. You have your bacteria and your fungi. And these are really important organisms in the fact that they are miners of nutrients. They have the enzymatic processes to strip nutrients and minerals from mineral sources in the soil. And so they're the ones that are going to be collecting those nutrients or getting nutrients made available for the plants. But when the fungi and the bacteria actually consume those nutrients into their bodies, it's not available for the plants because it's in the fungi or the bacteria. This is where you need the predator interaction. You need the organisms that are going to eat the bacteria and the fungi. The process of eating those and the waste that are exuded from that actual consumption, that's what makes soluble nutrients for plants. And this is where we get into nutrient cycling. We're going to use biology to cycle the nutrients and make them in a plant available form to be able to feed our plants. And there's an amazing aspect about this that we're going to talk about, how the plants actually drive the biology. They're going to try to push the biology to where it needs it so it can get the nutrients that it needs at the time frame it needs it in. And so you can see that this kind of predator-prey interaction goes from, bacteria and fungi to the protozoa, which are amoeba and flagellates and ciliates, to nematodes, to arthropods. And then those things get consumed by larger nematodes, larger arthropods, and those get consumed by animals, earthworms and things like that. So there's the whole predator-prey interaction that's really, really important for us to understand. Okay, so let's talk about nutrients. In the soil, in the mineral form in the ground, we kind of categorize it into three buckets. There are minerals, the mineral nutrients, which are held in a crystalline form, but they're not available to a plant. If a plant root goes up against a mineral form of a nutrient, it can't get access to it. There's the exchangeable, which is that the nutrients are weakly attached to some kind of sand, silt, or clay, but they're still usually not available to plants, but they can be made soluble. And then you have soluble nutrients. And so these are nutrients that are dissolved in solution, dissolved in water, and these are available for plants to be able to consume. So why is it important for us to understand this? Because this is where the bacteria and fungi really come into play. They are going to go after those mineral sources and exchangeable sources of nutrients, and they're going to, etch those away from those sources, consume them in their bodies, and now when they get to consume themselves, we've got soluble nutrients, plant available. All right, so let's talk about plants. What is their role in this whole soil biology or the soil food web? They have an extraordinary role. In fact, they have a really a controlling effect on the type and quantity of biology that exists in the soil. And so the plants themselves, they actually feed the biology. So you got to think about this. Mother Nature is extraordinarily efficient. And if a plant who's photosynthesizing and making, sugars and carbohydrates and proteins, and is taking that material and pushing it outside of its system into the soil, it's doing that to feed the biology. So the interaction between the biology and the plant would seem to be very important. If the plant's going to feed it, it's obviously expecting something in return. What's expecting is that biology is going to grow because the plants are feeding it, and then that biology is going to mine more of those nutrients for the plant. And again, that's an important, it was kind of an aha moment for me, which was, wow, the plants really, they're driving the biology to be able to get the nutrients that it needs. In the DNA of plants, it will make many different types of what we call exudates. And exudates are just a mix of sugars, carbohydrates, and proteins. And it makes different types of exudates to feed different types of biology. Some biology is better at mining, let's say, boron or copper or whatever mineral source. So when the plant gets to a position of saying, hey, I need boron because I'm going to go into some kind of flowering mode, it will start pushing out exudates that are going to be relative to biology that's really good at mining boron. So again, that interaction between plants and the soil biology is really, really important. All right, so we've kind of tied this all together. So let's just take a look at this, how this nutrient cycle actually works. So plants are going to release exudates to feed specific microbiology. So it's out there trying to feed the bacteria and the fungi. And then the bacteria and fungi are going to mine the soil and the organic matter that's in the soil for nutrients. And then that is going to get predated upon by your protozoa, your nematodes, your arthropods. And it's that predation that's going to release a soluble form of nutrients that the plant can now use. And this cycle occurs over and over and over again. And the wonderful thing about this is that you're letting the plant determine what it needs, when it needs it. And as long as the biology is there, it's home, it's in the soil, then when the plants feed that biology, they're going to wake up, they're going to start mining those nutrients, the plant gets the nutrient cycling, and it works. What we have in today's soils, though, is actually pretty poor soils. They've been, a lot of chemical products been applied, it's been tilled like crazy, so the biology is not there. And so we need to do something. We need to be able to make sure that that biology is in the soil, ready for those plants to be able to start pushing exudates to it. And so what we're going to talk about is how do we do that? What are the tools that we have available to get biology back into the soil? All right, so what are the 5 things that you can do now? And we're going to kind of break it down into first, source biologically complete compost. And I'm going to use this term hopefully over and over again, and I'm hoping that you folks will start to adopt this term. But biologically complete compost is important. It means it has compost that has the necessary biology to make an optimal food web, a soil food web. And the reason why I'm harping on the biologically complete part of this is that there is a vast majority of compost out there that is not biologically complete, nor do the producers of that compost make or even think about the biology that's in their compost. They're looking at it as organic matter, just it's a waste stream that they're able to convert and then turn around and sell as organic matter. But what we really want is we want biology in that compost, and there are some fantastic compost producers out there. So I don't want to discourage everybody and say, hey, there's nobody's out there selling biologically complete compost. That's not true. There are. And so like our folks at Sym Soil, there's other folks that in across the geography are actually making really, really fantastic compost. The other thing you can do though too is you can create your own compost. So you can make your own compost, and there is different types of compost. There's thermophilic compost, static compost, and vermicompost. But again, we're going to want to make sure we foster and maintain good biology in that compost. The second thing we want to do is start mulching and stop tilling your soil. We want to have a cover on our soil, and we want to stop tilling because tilling really has impact on the fungal networks. Think about all the energy that fungi is going to put into creating all this fungal hyphae in the soil, and we go around and till it. It just really destroys the fungal network, and it really sets it back. So no-till is a fantastic solution. The third is to make biologically complete extract. So this is one of our tools. We said we got compost, so that's a tool that we can use to get biology in the soil. But we can also take that compost, we can make an extract, which is in a liquid form, and we can use it for irrigation, doing soil drenches or deep root zone injections. So we'll talk about that. And the fourth is to make biologically complete tea. And so now we have to define, well, what's the difference between an extract and a tea? So we'll talk about when you use a tea and when we use an extract. And then the fifth one is stop/reduce the usage of chemical inputs. If you have the ability to completely stop, great. If you don't feel quite comfortable there yet, please try to reduce those chemical inputs and get yourself to a point where you don't have to use them anymore. So let's talk about compost. So I kind of define with that biologically complete compost. It has the necessary beneficial microorganisms to provide the optimal nutrient cycling. So again, when that plant wakes up and is pushing out exudates, that there's biology that's there in the soil that can say, yeah, I can go mine that boron or that copper and so forth. And the diversity of organisms is critical, and this is a key thing. There's sometimes this focus on reductionism, which is, let me go find that specific fungi or that specific bacteria that's really good at mining. I'm going to make sure it's present. What you really want to have is a mass diversity of organisms that are there so that certain climatic conditions or the exudates that plant is pushing out, that they're there to receive them. And so really diversity is the key thing that we're shooting for, not just trying to find the single fungi, the single bacteria that does the best at this. And so a good compost, a biologically complete compost, is going to have that diversity, which is really, really key. All right, so what can you do with biologically complete compost? First is you can use it directly on your soil. So you can top dress it. You can put some compost on top of your soil and maybe mulch on top of that. You can also till it into your soil. Now, remember, I said don't till. There is kind of this rule that we have, though, is it maybe it's your last till, or you have one till left until you're finished. And it really comes down to compaction. If your soil is really, really compacted, and I have a number of clients that have extraordinarily compacted soil, we'll go in with a plow, a deep ripper, a subsoiler, a yeoman's plow, something like that, and we'll break up that compaction layer. But the minute we're doing that, we're adding biology into the system. We want to make sure that we're getting those, either good organic matter with compost, or we're getting the biology into the system. And then after that, we don't till anymore. The other thing you can do with compost is you can make compost extracts and you can make compost teas. And this is the source material. So if it's got the biology in the compost, you can get the biology into a liquid form and you can use it that way. And the last thing I would say about compost is if it's biologically complete, it's a living system. And it's, think about the times that you've had compost piles or you've seen compost out in the middle of a parking lot, in bags that are just being baked by the sun. That's not a good thing. It's a living system that you want to be able to maintain. So if you get good biologically complete compost, make sure that it stays moist. Make sure that it stays covered. And there's still oxygen flow going into that compost. So put it in the right area so that you can maintain that biology. All right, so now you have biologically complete compost. You found the source, you made it yourself, you know it's got a lot of good organisms. The next thing you want to help yourself, especially with the soil, is mulching. And think of mulch as like a protective layer, as one of its functions. There's other functions that mulch can provide, but one of its functions is a protective layer. We actually find one of the most detrimental sources of compaction comes from rain. So if you have bare soil gets highly compacted by rain. It's a weight that's falling over and over on top of the surface of that soil. It compacts, it compacts, it compacts. If you provide a layer of mulch over the top of that bare soil, the mulch takes the impact. It absorbs that energy, and that compaction effect goes away. So you get a compaction protective layer. Mulch also helps keep moisture in the soil. So it has a moisture protection layer to it as well. So let's also talk about what are the different types of mulches that you can use. So I like to categorize mulches into two categories. We have what we call living mulches and brown mulches. A living mulch is a perennial cover plant, a cover crop, something that's going to stick around for a long time. And I know a lot of people get kind of freaked out about this because they think, oh, hey, that cover plant is going to compete with my crop. Well, in a biological system, that's not necessarily true. That plant is going to be feeding biology. It's going to be pushing out exudates and making sure there's a good soil food web, as long as with your other plants. Now, you have to have some care when you're doing this. If you're going to plant, let's say, a plant that grows tall and it likes to smother and wrap around plants, and you put carrots down, that's not going to be a good solution. It may work very well for tomatoes that you trellis up really high, but it's not going to work very good for carrots. So you have to think through what type of perennial cover plant would match the plant that you're trying to grow. The other type of mulch is a brown mulch, and so this is an organic matter. And the nice thing about this is it will break down over time. So it adds organic matter and nutrients back into the soil. And in brown mulches, I tend to like the woodier sources of brown mulch, like wood chips as an example, because they provide very good fungal foods. And we find that most of our agricultural soils today are lacking in fungi tremendously, especially if it was in a tilled type of operation. So providing wood chips is a good alternative to that. Now, I know a lot of people have had a challenge or a problem using wood chips. The key with using wood chips is you need to let them age, or what we call condition the wood chips. When you make wood chips out of fresh green wood, some trees are worse than others. They have a lot of antimicrobial properties to them. That's how the wood protects itself. You want to let those compounds volatilize off or be consumed by biological systems before you add them on as a mulch into your beds. For me as a practice, when I get wood chips, I typically wait 6 months. So I get wood chips here, I either make them myself or I've had them brought in. I let them six months at least before I use them. The other thing I'm doing too with my wood chips is I inoculate those piles with compost extract. So I want to make sure that they're really loaded full of a lot of good biology, especially fungi, to start breaking down that wood. So I use those aged wood chips on top of my systems, and it works really, really well. Okay, so the next thing we can do is compost teas and compost extracts. All right, so let's talk about teas and extracts really quick. Why a tea? Why an extract? A tea is simply this. You have biology in solution, you're going to add a food source, and you're going to add oxygen into the liquid. And what you're trying to do is exponentially grow biology. And when you do that, bacteria is going to grow very, very fast, and it creates these biological glues, bioslimes. And what's important about that is that once you get a lot of those bacterial glues and you go out to spray that on the surface of a leaf, a foliar application, that droplet, a lot of that biology starts to stick and adhere to the surface of the leaf. So we use teas for foliar applications to help provide an armor or a barrier to prevent fungal diseases like powdery mildew or downy mildews and things like that. So to think of teas, they are for foliar applications. Extracts, it's really kind of the same process as a tea. We're going to knock the biology off the compost, put it into a solution, but we're not going to add food, and we don't necessarily have to add aeration. So we haven't created a lot of those biological glues. They will tend not to stick to surfaces and actually start to percolate down through the soil. You don't necessarily want to use a tea for a soil drench. You'll find a lot of the biology will get stuck up on the surface of the organic matter and right at the very surface of the soil. You want to use extracts in that sense. And the other thing you can do with extracts is drench the soil, but you can also use a tool like a deep root zone injector, which you can go down into the soil at some depth and apply the biology there. Okay, so teas and extracts are great tools to be able to use. All right, so as a home gardener or somebody who's really just wanting to get biology onto their soil, let's talk about a really simple way to make compost extract. And it really becomes really simple for you to do. All you need is really kind of 4 pieces of equipment. You need biological complete compost. So we talked about the importance. Make sure your compost has good biology on it. The second is a compost tea bag. Most compost tea bags are what we call a 400 micron size pore opening, and that's what you should get. It will keep most of the material, the organic matter, out of the solution while it lets a lot of the biology flow through that mesh and get into solution. A plastic tote or a bucket is what you need to be able to store this water in. And then you need water. So those are your 4 materials that you need. Now, the water's a little bit tricky because you may need to treat it. So think of it like this. If you're in the city and you know that your municipality is treating their water with chlorine or chloramine, it's detrimental to biology. That's the whole purpose of why it's there. So you may need to treat that water before you actually use it to make a compost extract. All right, so how do you treat your water? Humic acid is a fantastic way to complex out the chloramine that might be in that water. And you don't need much. You can buy humic acid, in a liquid form. It comes in a bottle. You can use 1 drop per gallon, and it will complex out that chlorine or chloramine. If you have really good biologically complete compost, you can take some, filtered water or, water that doesn't have any chlorine or chloramine and just run it through your compost to extract some humic acid and then use that to treat the overwater before you put the compost bag inside of. So there's just some consideration you have to do around if you have chlorine or chloramine. If you're on a well, you're probably not going to have this issue. A lot of irrigation water, you're not going to have this issue as well. Okay, so that's your equipment. The process is simply this. Use about now, the amount of compost that you use really depends upon the quality of the compost, but let's just say you have good biologically complete compost. You only need about 1/4 of a pound of compost to a gallon of water. So make those measurements, get the, whatever your tote is. If you have a 20-gallon tote, then I think you're gonna need 4 pounds or 5 pounds of compost, right? So you just do the simple math to kind of come up with your equation should be. You place the compost in the compost tea bag. You fill the container with water. Again, treat it if you need to. Place the compost tea bag into the water and massage the compost tea bag for about 2 minutes. And what I suggest is this: when you're massaging it, think of it like you're kneading bread. You don't want to be too hard with it, and you don't want to be too soft. It's kind of a knead and squish, right? You're trying to knock biology off of the surface of that compost and put it into solution. Then you remove your compost tea bag, and you're done. You can use this compost extract. And if you want to spread it out over a much larger area and put it in a sprayer, you can dilute it down too. You can dilute it to whatever you want. But we find with good biologically complete compost, you can add as little as 20 gallons per acre. Now it's hard to get 20 gallons per acre spread out, so you can dilute it down and you can still get that 20 gallons per acre effect. Okay, so Not intimidating, should be really easy, and you can make great compost extract. And that's such a good tool to be able to get biology into your soil. All right, so if you're going to get into the brewers, there are a lot of different brewers that are out there, and they can go from thousands of dollars down to you can build it yourself for 10, 15, 20, $30. Um, just think of it like this. You want to make sure you have air, and this is again for making compost tea. You want to make sure you have enough air to keep the solution above 6 parts per million oxygen, but a good volume of air, and you want to create this vortexing effect. So when you see a brewer like this cone tank, air comes off the bottom, goes up to the top, a big column of air. It causes the water to fall back down the sides, and you get a vortex. You're stirring that water. You're making sure it's always aerated. You can always get down to a 5-gallon bucket. And what I don't like on this picture is air stones. I would cut the air stones off and just have it as bubbles coming out of the hoses. And you can make tea in that sense as well. The other thing I would just highly recommend when you're making a compost tea, don't use too much food. The propensity for people is to add way too much food into their teas. Um, Resist that urge and use your nose as a really good tool. If you start smelling foul things coming from your compost tea, you've added too much food or you don't have enough air. Foul smells usually means it's gone anaerobic. And again, we want to keep things aerobic as we possibly can. The last thing I'll mention about tea brewers is clean, clean, clean. Every time that you use it, make sure it is as clean, almost like clean as you got it from when you bought it from the manufacturer. I know that's kind of impossible, but you know what I mean. Clean it, clean it, clean it. That way, every time you're starting to use it, you're not starting with some anaerobic conditions already in the brewer. And the way we apply extracts and teas, you can spray it, you can drench it, you can do root zone injection. The only condition with teas is that since you've been adding a bunch of air, and once you put in your sprayer, you're no longer adding air, it can go easily anaerobic. So you want to use teas within a 4-hour window. Time is of the essence with a tea. An extract, not as much. Sometimes you can wait 8 hours, 10, 12. I mean, in fact, if you don't have that much biology, you can go almost 24 hours before you use it. Okay, so we've talked about all these different methodologies. Let's just look at an example from my homestead and work that I was doing. So we're going to look at two things, an area I call the side garden and a food forest that we created in our backyard. So the side garden, it was a mix of the storage area. It was a dirt road that went through part of that and a woodland area. So a really mixed use kind of area. Some of the soils were highly compacted, other soils were not. The other thing, we didn't use any chemical sprays. We've been chemical free on our property for 9 years now. Some of the ground, it was highly compacted. Again, some had no compaction. And the soil profile where I live is pretty thin. We have about 2 to 3 feet of soil before we hit bedrock. So I know that's the kind of profile that I have to be able to work with. All right, so in this side garden, I was we're doing a test on corn. So I had 2 rows that I was looking at corn here, and figure this area where I put the corn was where the dirt road was at. So it was highly compacted when I first put it in there. So it was actually pretty poor. But the way I treated these beds is I soaked the seeds, the corn seeds, in compost extract for about 12 hours before I planted them. And I top dressed each one of these beds over here with about 1/8 of an inch of compost. So very, very small amount of compost. And then on top of that compost, I put a layer of aged wood chip, probably about 1/2 inch to 1 inch of aged wood chip on top of that. We got fantastic germination. I like soaking, there's a number of types of seeds that I soak in compost extract. I find that I get really good germination when I do that. I think we were about 99% germination, which was crazy high. So it was really good in that sense. And then look at 30 days into the growth. The plant vigor is really, really strong. And by this 30 days, we've done 1 application of compost extract. At 44 days, here's Adam. He's one of the interns that worked on the farm. So you can get some scale, but the corn was between 6 and 9 foot tall. And at 70 days, we were harvesting, and it was about 10 days earlier than expected for that particular variety of corn. And we've got multiple ears per stalk, which was fantastic. And at 105 days, some of the corn we left on is dry. We harvested and we chopped the plants down. And you'll see we actually use that as a mulch on top of the beds. A couple other notables here. So we talked about the compost extract being applied. So you can see Adam's actually here with a hose, and he's applying the compost extract, directly in there. And we applied that at a rate of 20 gallons per row. So we loaded up pretty good with amount of compost extract. The other thing that I would mention is on corn, you get tillers that usually occur in two scenarios. One, when nutrients are abundant, or the
Did Brian get a little?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Looks
I
like
can
my
hear you
headset,
fine.
yeah,
Can
my
everyone else
headset
hear Brian all right?
kind of crazy. I think my headset kind of cut off there.
Yeah. Well, luckily
Yeah.
everyone's saying they can still hear you, so
All right,
all
perfect.
good.
Okay, good, good.
Great.
So in this case, the stalks were not damaged. The corn put on tillers because it was, abundant in nutrients. And the nice thing about tillers, you'll get one or two small ears of corn as an addition to it. But it also showed to us it had a lot of good plant vigor. The interpretation I took away from this is that this corn was very happy growing where it was at, and it felt that it could put on those tillers and produce that extra amount of corn. So the vigor of the plants was really, really good. And now, this is a measurement called Brix, and it measures the amount of sugars in a plant or a fruit or a vegetable. And it's kind of a subjective measurement. It's not necessarily telling me how healthy the plant is or how nutrient dense the food is, but it does give me an indicator that the plant had enough vigor to actually create a good amount of sugars. And so when you look at corn, you have a measurement between poor and excellent. Our mean Brix for our corn was 22.67. So it fit right there in that kind of excellent range. And think of it like this. This is first year bed. So in 1 year's time frame, I was able to grow excellent corn. And I'm sure subsequent years would be pushing even above, the excellent range. We find on our homestead, in fact, my wife teases me a lot. I have a Brix meter. I walk around the property and I Brix everything. I'm just obsessed by Brixing stuff, just because I like to be able to see how many sugars. On our homestead, since we've gone to the biological methodology, almost all of our fruit and vegetables are at that excellent or, well above, which to me, I haven't done a plant nutrient analysis. I haven't sent it in to say, hey, exactly where the nutrient density of this food, but it tastes great. And my expectations is that it's very nutrient dense. Okay, so we've gone through the whole gardening, and then we want to prep for next year. So in this case, I wanted to put a soil building cover crop in there. I'm not ready to put my perennial cover plants in yet, but so I planted a mix of vetches and bell beans and fabas and things like that, and let the cover crop grow up, and over the fall/winter, early spring time frame, and then I cut it down and use it as mulch. I think I also use a lot of this in making compost. The other thing too is if you're going to use cover crops, make sure that you have an inoculum, especially if it's a nitrogen fixing cover crop. You want to make sure you have the right rhizobium bacteria. That helps it fix the nitrogen. And so we made sure we inoculated. We cut it with we soaked the seeds with compost extract, and then we also put the rhizobium inoculum in there. And then we also used the corn leaf material, and we crushed it and put it as a layer of mulch on top of those beds. So again, reusing the material that we already had on hand. And the cover crop grew through the, like I said, fall and winter, and in springtime we actually cut it down. Okay, so that was the side garden, and I want to show you another example that we have here in the homestead. So when we built our homestead, we live on a piece of property that's sloped, and we wanted to put a backyard in. And when we had a bulldozer, when they cut the pad for our house, actually cut a pad for a lawn area. And this was cut all the way down to bedrock. And in fact, we only added, I think, about 2 inches of soil and then put sod on top of that. And this lawn was awful. I mean, it was horrible. It was always, it never could grow good roots. It got brutalized in the summertime frame. And, our lifestyles changed, and we're like, we don't need a lawn in the backyard. Let's make something productive out of it. So we decided to create a food forest. And you can see the second picture here. The way we made our food forest is I dug trenches and in these two areas, and I made hugel trenches. Hugel culture is just a technology or methodology of taking rotten wood and putting either in a mound or burying it in a trench. And what it does is it adds a lot of organic matter, a lot of fungal foods, and it really becomes a good habitat, especially as the species are starting to establish. The roots can grow into, they can get moisture. There's nutrient cycling happening, so it's a good thing to use. Just a piece of advice: if you're going to make a hugel trench or hugel bed, try to source or use rotten wood or wood that you've conditioned. There's a lot of fungal growth already in there. If you use fresh wood, it's just going to take a lot longer for it to break down. So we created these hugel trenches, and then we put in a very multi-species mix of fruit trees, blueberries, service berries, gummy berries, artichokes, herbaceous plants. There's about 30 different species in the small area that we planted in here. And this is year 3, so you can see we've already got fantastic growth. A lot of good mulching happening here. A lot of the plants I selected are mulching. Jerusalem artichoke is a fantastic plant for that. And then over here is year 4. So within a 4-year period of time, these plum trees are producing. They are really, really producing food. I think I'm averaging of edible food close to 100 pounds per tree, and that's just, if I thinned it a little bit better, I could probably push that a little bit higher. But overall, the systems here, the soil is highly fungal. It fits very, very well for the types of species that we have in here. We're extraordinarily happy that we've created a very good habitat for the soil biology, and then subsequently the plants grow very well. Okay, so in closing, things I want to leave you with is make sure you can establish and maintain a good soil food web. Soil biology is optimal for soil health, so make sure you got a good diversity and mix of soil biology. Use the tools that you have to be able to do this. That's compost teas, and compost extracts. Again, make sure you're either making or sourcing biologically complete products, and start growing crops that are healthy and productive, and without pests, without diseases, and all that good stuff. Make a healthier product for yourself or for others. If you have any questions, you can contact me, and my email address is down below. So Raleigh, at this point, I think I'll hand it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, that was amazing, because I think it's really actionable, making extracts, learning how to mulch. Like these are kind of basic things, but they're so effective. And even knowing about where to get biologically complete compost, that's huge. And thank you for putting in all the time and information and energy into this. It's fantastic.
No
And if
worries.
folks want to
Yeah.
work with Brian, you can reach out to him in that email. He's an amazing soil consultant. He works with farms from small scale to very large ones. He runs a lab. So yeah, if you want to work with an amazing soil consultant, reach out to Brian. So he is
Thanks, Raleigh.
fantastic. You got it. All right. So